Okay, so now we're moving into the applied section, or reapplied, I should say. I'm going to show just a variety of past work that I hope illustrates what you can do with the observed and remembered and building the visual library and understanding of vehicles to create original forms. So here's a bunch of hovercraft lining up at, who knows, maybe this is some sort of sports bar or something. And from observing those propeller prop planes, put that with hang glider knowledge, a sailplane knowledge, and I have a love of these little wacky pod shapes, and then the sort of landing gear off of an old Navy plane. And you can start to create somewhat believable original vehicles. And so these are all examples of taking the sort of years of observation and study and drawing, and then reapplying those things, drawing upon what we talked about at the very beginning in the intro, which was about those 4 areas of study with the way things work, right, the way they look, the Viscomp skills to communicate that to others, plus the design philosophy. The next step we're going to move into, and this is a little sailplane that's got obviously an exposed cockpit, very futuristic, maybe some sort of very small turbine engine, which needs air in and then air out, some control surfaces, so the thing might be able to fly, and and then that applied to a blimp, same sort of construction, some sort of frame. Again, think back to that biplane we saw in the last chapter that had the exposed struts, and then this same sort of construction here. It's just covered with a big translucent skin, which is the lifting volume. What I was starting to say is that we're going to go into the next section, which is going to talk about building the concept, and that's why I'll talk more specifically about the design approach. But again, this hopefully sets an example of the sort of things you can start to design with your sort of study and knowledge building in addition to form building. So these are some concept bicycles I did a while back. Here's again the more themed pirate ship. So now we've got the painted skull on the front and some skeleton hanging from the front. Obvious warning signs, right? The school of sharks that follow it everywhere, and probably some ravens hovering around the back there. So these would be examples of reapplying the knowledge from observation, and then it makes it much easier for me to sit down and sketch this straight up as my first sketch, because I've put in sort of the hours and the practice to build my visual library to make a somewhat believable pirate ship, and knowing the proper proportions, knowing the balance. And so here's an example of a wooden boat, much more sort of futuristic version of a wooden boat, but it has the the caulking between the wood planks across the deck, maybe now a shiny automotive painted and sculpted air intake, things like that, maybe a much more formed windshield than they can make of that period. There's another example. So these are more now rendered and refined versions. And, you notice that there's some of the fasteners, but, maybe this is a more advanced version. And so these are really, the fasteners are there just sort of as a design nod back to that era where you would have seen them sort of on every bulkhead. And here it's just a few towards the back. This is getting even a little bit more futuristic with this array of these single cockpit, this 3-person arrangement at the front. And it's really fun to build on. Basically, it's very simple, older boat shape, and then infuse a little bit of futurism and fantasy by dropping in this cockpit position. This is a Hot Wheel I designed a while ago, and the idea here was it's a semi-truck chassis, so a pair of wheels up front, some dualies in the back, and sort of the general configuration stays the same, in that there's a big engine, some exhaust pipes, an intake, bumper, etc. But and then the big diesel tanks, of course, on the side. But then locating him in a completely ridiculous Hot Wheels position, where of course he doesn't need to be able to see to drive this monster vehicle. But again, I could draw from automotive form knowledge applied to the sort of the engineering and structure of a semi-truck chassis. So again, these are just some examples of reapplying the observed and remembered form language that I now have in my visual library of how cut lines work, how surfaces work, how the graphics work across the shape, the proportion, what does a sports car look like, things like that. Here's some fantasy hovercraft. So you'll see a whole range of style, and we're going to talk about that pretty soon, on how to mentally approach different styles. You'll see quite a difference here if we look at this little 7. The form language happening here versus this number 8 versus this sort of hot rod inspired, maybe Art Deco influenced one versus this organic thing that's really heavy into the sort of value graphics and that are across that surface versus the angular there. That'll be what we talk about in the coming chapters. So again, just to show a range from airplanes to boats to blimps to cars to air cargo or seagoing ground effect vehicle here based on some old Russian ground effect transports. And there's a boat, I think we'll see that coming along, but it fits in the back of this thing. This is for a video game a while back. To little super quick sketches of a submarine. But again, I've seen submarines. I know what a propeller looks like. I know the physics of what a propeller needs to do. So, where does it provide the thrust? Control surfaces, again, same thing here. From going to boat yards and things like that and taking the photos, doing the study, knowing how it has to, get up and plane and have a relationship to this horizontal ground or water plane in this case. And, not to mention, an anchor, all those sort of things lend realism, a comm tower, all those things you might normally, it adds a richness to your designs that it's very easy to forget. These are all based off of ants, actually, so there's some little sci-fi spaceships, and so Neville Page had a great book of ants, shot, super detailed black and white shots, and so I did a bunch of study of those, which as you do more and more of this sort of drawing from observation and from photographs and reality, you can you'll get to a point where you start to be able to skip that remembered stage of drawings that I showed you. So for instance, back to that Cobra I showed you, or the hot rod, that sort of thing, that sketch, you'll sort of be able to look at the reference, right, that you've taken from a museum or off the internet, wherever, and then let it influence an original design. So be able to draw an original design at the same time pulling back to some reference. And this is not referenced to a little flying thing. I mean, there you can really see the ant. It's referenced an ant. Here's the head and the mandible there, and right, the body split in the thorax and all that stuff. And you can then start to interpret this as some sort of futuristic spaceship, right? And the really simple thing to do with vehicles, to give it an immediacy of something we as humans can relate to, is to include a cockpit. So there's a little glass structure, and we can see the person in there. Same here, a little windshield area, and we can see the people in there. This one, not so much, so it looks more like an ant. But this one, a little cockpits here and some rear-facing thing there. But it helps us set the scale, so I always think about the people and where they go, and do we see them? And here's our cockpit. There's a guy right up in there. So another couple guys down here. But it gives a sense of scale. So that's just another, sort of a painted version of one of those ant ships, but it's got the cut lines, the fasteners, and starting to blend together, my visual library getting pushed into an abstract form of a organic ant being the source and the inspiration to build that design from. Here's a little submarine and a couple of subs. So just quick sketches. So whether it shows up in a sketch or a rendering, the idea is that, from having drawn a bunch of old classic, warplanes from the 40s, then, that's where the fuselage kind of came from. Same with a sort of aircraft-inspired cockpit, but then coupled with this, huge sort of odd-looking propeller at the back. But control surfaces, so the thing can, plane up and down, and then turn left and right with a rudder at the back. So as you'll see, they all have what would be the aircraft elevator, right, to lift up and down, and then rudders, right, and those are positioned in different spots to make it original. These are a bunch of cars I did for a video game called Swipeout a few years back. Again, and these are supposed to be very toy-like for young kids. But again, you can jump right in and start to do a variety of forms with a sort of deep understanding of how objects are built and a rich visual library. And I think we're near the end of this chapter. These are a couple of hovercraft. That was a slightly recolored version of the cover from our very first book, Concept Design 1. But again, trying to pull in different forms. This one being a bit more geometric. This one being a bit more like a odd gold-colored turkey. But all in good fun, and having a rich library helps that. This is our last slide, I think, for this chapter. These are some VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing service aircraft that was to service this Hero vehicle from a game. And so it swoops down, lifts this thing up into the belly. But again, started with understanding, I need some engines for vertical thrust. What form is it going to take? This big sort of delta wing with a little canard wing up front. And then you can mix and match, and a big part of doing vehicle design now, because there's been so much work done, is to recombine what's already been done, but in a slightly fresher or more original combination of maybe dissimilar functional items, but things like that. And so vehicle design is really, especially fantasy vehicle design, is about recombining, and that's where having a deeper or a richer visual library or a better visual literacy will make it that much easier. So let's move into how to build up a concept.